And it's called St. Kevin and the Blackbird. So what I'm doing this is because people are sort of in this rational brain, and that's fine. You've got to get here and you've got to pay attention to stop signs and all the rest of it. But I'm trying to sort of open up another little part of yourself. It's a bit more intuitive, it's a bit more able to engage, it's a different way of communicating, etc. And you'll get it from the poem, where we're going. Okay, St. Kevin and the Blackbird. And then there was St. Kevin and the Blackbird. The saint is kneeling, arms stretched out, inside his cell, but the cell is narrow, so one turned up palm is out the window, stiff as a crossbeam, when a blackbird lands and lays in it and settles down to nest. Kevin feels the warm eggs, the small breast, the tuck-neat head and claws, and, finding himself linked into the network of eternal life, is moved to pity. Now he must hold his hand like a branch out in the sun and rain for weeks until the young are hatched and fledged and flown. And since the whole thing's imagined anyhow, imagine being Kevin. Which is he, self-forgetful or in agony all the time? From the neck on down through his hurting forearms, are his fingers sleeping? Does he still feel his knees? Or has the shut-eyed blank of under-earth crept up through him? Is there distance in his head, alone and mirrored clear in love's deep river? To labour and not seek reward, he prays, a prayer his body makes entirely. For he has forgotten self, forgotten bird, and on the riverbank, forgotten the river's name. Okay, so while that's ostensibly a Christian poem, I'm going to be exploring the history of the syncretism between the pagan or the animist and the Christian in the Gaelic context. So if you want to understand or reimagine what the pagan can mean, or for the historical roots of many people in this room of how your ancestors engaged with land and language and culture and cosmos, I'm going to give the history of how that was undone over a 5,000 year period we're sort of looking at. Just to sort of, I'm not going to go too much into the prehistory, but that's what we're doing today. So if I'm going along and you go, what the hell is he talking about? Just put your hand up, that's fine, I'm not that precious. And just say, can you please explain that again, or speak a bit slower, or what language are you speaking? So what I want to do now is I just want to do something that maybe doesn't happen that often, and usually we do it for Indigenous people, but we don't do it for non-Indigenous people. So I want to call up the ancestors now, the ones that are present. And I know they're present because you have skin and bone and blood and you're breathing. And I know they're there, and I want to call up the good ones, because I know plenty of us have got not so good ones too. The ones that help you and guide you and keep you out of trouble. Don't do that. Don't do that, idiot, because you're going to get in such a world of pain. And it's like, oh, thank you for telling me that. I sort of forgot. So those ancestors, I want them just to be present with you when you're here. Now, I know for a lot of people that's getting a bit weird, but good. Okay, so the question I'm asking, and this is the sort of root question underpinning the storytelling centre as well, is where do we find the stories and the storytellers that can inform and guide us in times of social upheaval and ecological crises? Because it's not only about storytelling, it's also, I'm going to suggest, we're in a context of collapse, ecological and social collapse. And you can sort of avoid it, or you can sort of open to it and go, okay, this is a profound challenge and possible liberation going on here. But of course it's very unsettling. And if you aren't emotionally able to work with that, it's even more difficult. And I think that's part of the reason why there is such a profound re-emergence within Indigenous cultures, but also non-Indigenous peoples, where these questions are coming to the fore. Because it's actually party time. It's like, oh shit, here we go. So again, I'm not going to labour that, and I'm not going to push that one too hard, because I know we're going to have a few psychic breakdowns in the room, but and appropriately so. But yeah, that's the sort of underpinning. So I want to play with your brain a little bit, and I want to play on that imagery of the spiral. So I want to start this story at the end, finding our way in a circular motion back to where we started. Because we live in this very linear understanding of the world, where the past is here and the future's there, and we've got this, and we're sort of caught in this trap. And I want to start playing with us on this question of time and whether the ancestors are actually from the future and not the past. And it's just sort of starting to play with what's actually real. And this isn't unwarranted, or this is we're the first people ever say this. This is like most of human history, this is how most humans have lived, and it's not a big deal. In the last 250 years, it is a big deal, since the so-called Enlightenments in France and Scotland. But playing on that spiral imagery, working the spirals. So let our footsteps mirror the movements of the celestial beings in the night sky. So again, you can only do that if you're actually linked to the night sky. You're part of the cosmos. You're not separate from it. You actually belong in that place. And you have stories that link you to what's going on. And there's that interrelationship between the ancestors and the places where you live. So as above, so below. So I'll just offer you one little word in Irish, Boan. And this is a goddess. And she's the one who looks after, one of the people that looks after the well of Sagas. And she also is the name with the root of the River Boyne, which is one of the main sort of, and I'll talk about it in a minute, one of the main sort of spiritual centres of Ireland. But her meaning of her name is White Cow. And White Cow is also the Milky Way. And you're like, aha. So this language, and Gaelic, Irish, A, the cows are really popular, and B, you just start seeing how it's woven into the language. The language weaves you into place. So she's the river, but she's also the stars, and this goddess, this white goddess. And there's a place called Brunabonda, which we'll talk about, and that's temple to Boan. That's temple to the goddess. So it's like, oh, there's all this weaving, and it's like, exactly. So that's what I really want to share, some of the weaves. Okay, so this is a place important to me. So through my father's mother, they're called McGraths, McCrae, which means son of grace. And this is Loch Jeddig in Donegal. Now, since the 11th century, it's been a major Christian pilgrimage site. I was there 6 months ago doing the pilgrimage, fasting and doing lots of circumambulations around the basilica at 3 in the morning, not sleeping and just praying like crazy. I wasn't there as a Christian. I was there as a sort of reclaiming the family roots and the ancestral roots. But this has also been a pilgrimage site pre-Christian as well. So just sort of weaving you in, and this is my connection to this place in Donegal. Now, of course, all this was smashed, which I'll talk about a very little bit, in the 17th century. So on that place, Station Island, which is now often you'll find in those incredibly sacred sites, they're also pagan sites as well at the same time. And the Christians weren't silly. They slap bang on the middle, they chuck a big church on top and they go, yeah, this is a powerful place. Everyone's sort of worshipping or engaging in this relationship to this place. So we chuck a big church on top. Okay, you're still going to the same place. You're still doing the same thing, but it's just now got this layering going on. And that's what we're talking about. So this place was called St. Patrick's Purgatory, but in the 17th century it was closed down. The cave was seen as too much. Cave is often womb. It's a place where you go and maybe initiations, maybe you go back into the dark and you're reborn and you come back out. I'm sure you've heard that motif somewhere else. It's not a new motif, it's a sort of one of the eternal motifs. But in the early 17th century it was closed down on October 25th, 1632. It was basically a sort of... And so my relatives were co-arps, they were the ecclesiastical, they looked after, so we know that because the surnames didn't exist in Ireland until the 11th century. So the McGrath surname goes back to then. So we don't know before that. But from the 11th to then, we know the McGraths, one of the sort of Feely families, the storytelling families, they looked after this sacred place. So it's a cave on an island in a lake. And it's still a major pilgrimage site. But what I want to do is I want to bring you into the question of Seamus Heaney. He wrote an amazing, and in the Irish literary tradition, there's at least 7 major poets have gone to Station Island and written poems about their experiences there because it is a major place. And when you go, if you go there and do stuff, you know, you're not the same person when you come back. And that's true for me too. I didn't go there as a Catholic, even though I have that background, but I had also big things happen there as well. But, yep. At the time, because it was seen as too pagan, because there's been this battle within Christendom where the Irish had their own type of church. It was called the Gaelic Church until about the 12th century or so, and they pretty much kept up a lot of their own traditions and their own social structure. And the church in Rome did not like that. They did their own thing, and they were like, shut them up, stop that stuff. And so going into caves and stuff, it's got too much circumambulating a pond is one thing, or a sacred well, but going into caves and actually having visions. And that's why it's called purgatory, because often you have visions of hell or you'd meet demons or spirits or whatever. So obviously there's some sort of shamanic element to it. And so they wanted to just close that down because they wanted the priests to be the arbiters of that, not whoever it was that was running those things, because they were a counterpower. And they didn't want that. They wanted total control. But I'll explain that in a bit more when I talk about the structure of the church. So Seamus Heaney went there, and what he did in this book was he went there and he met 12 dead people in the poem, ancestors, and he dialogued with them all. And so one of the ones he does, which is the 12th one, he talks with James Joyce, who's like, if you know anything about Irish literature, he's in the 20th century or even the whole thing, he met the spirit of James Joyce. So he met the dead. So he was doing exactly what that place was always for, meeting the dead, working with the ancestors. So, you know, he is a Catholic, but he's also a very pagan Catholic. It's that Irish version. If we have this discussion in Ireland, half the room's going, yeah, you're telling me nothing. We know that already. So in Australia, people have little heart attacks about it, but in Ireland, it's just normal. It's part of the culture, no big deal. So he asks James Joyce, he says, how do we fix this broken storytelling tradition? So he goes to this place. How do we fix this storytelling tradition that's been destroyed? It was destroyed in the 17th century. We were able to sneaky keep it alive, which I'll explain in a minute. And so he makes this poem and does this thing to James Joyce, which I'll read some of. This is Joyce's response to Heaney's question about how we fix the storytelling tradition that was smashed. The main thing is to write for the joy of it. Cultivate a work lust that imagines its haven like your hands at night. Dreaming the sun in the sunspot of a breast, you are fasted now, light-headed, dangerous. Take off from here and don't be so earnest, so ready for the sackcloth and the ashes. Let go, let fly, forget. You've listened long enough, now strike your note. So basically what Joyce's response was, you've got to trust in what you're doing and go for it, because there is no answer. I'm up. And of course you can argue whether he really met him or not, or whether it's true, but I don't care about that. This is a poetic sensibility, and what we're doing is, this is the storytelling tradition telling its own stories about how they reimagine their storytelling tradition. And of course Dante for the Irish is central, if you know anything about the Italian, Dante Alighieri. For Joyce, for Beckett, for Heaney. Without Dante, there is no reimagining. So it's that Catholic imaginary. So, again, with all of its illusions. So I bring you into that just to sort of, with the poem from Heaney, just to sort of start opening up what we're about, the big opening we're about to sort of engage in. Okay, so now part of what I want to do is I want to explain how the storytelling tradition was broken, and then obviously in other talks actually talk about reimagining it, even in the Healesville base, which of course has a layup here, and part of the reason I'm choosing Healesville, or Healesville's choosing me if I be honest, is because of the legacy of trauma here, in terms of the history of Corranderk, and we've actually got this layering. It was a sacred place, it's been traumatised, and yeah, the Irish, we love that, you know, that's our favourite area, you know, trauma, war, craziness, genocide, starvation, yep, bring it all on, baby. So, language destruction, cultural destruction, yeah, we know that shit, closer than our hair on our head. So it's not that we have answers to that, it's just we're not afraid of that. It's just like, we just hold that, because that's what we hold anyway, if we're honest. And that ancestral connection, there's lots of that. So the broken storytelling tradition in the Irish, and here I'm talking Irish, but really when I say Gael, that's also very much part of Western Scotland, Iceland, and we'll talk about that in a minute, Isle of Man, Wales, England as well, but they got hammered by the Romans early doors, so that's a bit sort of smashed up there. But in the Irish context, because I know it better, is largely a result of the protracted violence, dispossession and language destructions visited upon the lands, waters and many beings of the island of Ireland by what became the British Empire. And I'll explain that now. That's what I'll be doing in the next little while. Because in 1169, when the Anglo-Normans turned up, they weren't called English and they weren't called the British Empire. So I've got to explain that history a little bit as we go. Thanks. So that's what I'm saying, what became the British Empire, because we're talking an 800-year history. So, sorry?
When was that? When did the British Empire arrive?
I'll explain. I will explain that. But the British Empire, because Ireland was its experimentation zone. So really it was when the Tudors in the 16th century, 17th century, that violence, that primitive accumulation, which I'll talk about, was the precursor to the British Empire, and that was the 17th century. But you have to explain the 5 centuries prior. Well, I'm going to do the whole thing. But yeah, that's exactly what I'm explaining. So in the 17th century, any remnants of a traditional Celtic pagan social structure, of which the poets or the Fili and their schools were destroyed. So different people have different views of, so you could argue certain elements of the pagan tradition survives in Ireland, true. So structures around stone circles, portal tombs, passage tombs, etc. They still survive, but the stories relating to them, they've been often hammered. And you can argue in different areas it was different places and different times. Some people say it's the 19th century it was broken up, others say it was earlier than that. But I don't think that's really the main argument. The main argument is what do we do now? How do we heal these brokenness rather than I'm right and you're wrong? It's like, well, maybe so. Okay, whatever. So there's three elements to this argument I'm making. So one is a sort of animist pagan cosmological perspective. I'm weaving that through, and as I said, the next time I speak at Hills of Library, I'll be exploring how storytelling relates to that, because that's part of what a reclamation is, and it's a very different way of being in the world. And then there's the question of an unbroken oral storytelling tradition. And when I say storytelling, I don't just mean telling stories, telling history, keeping genealogies, singing, poetry. In the Gaelic world, that's all poetry. No one actually had these distinctions, these categories don't really exist. They were all seen as, if you will, the land speaking, and there's many ways to do it, and they're just as important at each other. And so it's not just someone telling us mythic story of Fionn McCool or Cuchulainn or something. It also can be singers about the fox or the otter or the seal and their relationships to that place. Or it can be, there's many, or people telling genealogies or histories like I'm doing right now. It's a form of storytelling. Because without this history, then people can't really grasp what the storytelling is. That's why it's another form. So it's not as demarcated and categorised and, which everything now is in these little, poetry section in the library. Poetry would have been like, all of that. That's poetry, all of it. It's like, oh yeah, that one. We like that one. And then the third one, and this is the one that's obviously got big echoes in this room, in this place, is what does it mean to be Indigenous to a place? What does it mean to belong? And what does it mean to have obligations to a place to actually look after, nurture and support the flourishing of all life in that place? Good questions to ask.
Like an Aboriginal.
Correct. Aboriginals from different places. Aboriginals with white skin. Yeah. Exactly. So Indigeneity, Robin Wall Kimmerer, you may have heard of her. She wrote that great book, Sweetgrass, is that right? Braiding the Sweetgrass, yes. Lots of you are here because of her, and I read her too. I like her as well. Indigeneity creates reciprocal relations with all life. And that's when I think you're becoming Indigenous, when you just start having these interactions and relationships and you start going, aha. Now, of course, that word is explosive in the Australian context, but it's just, we need to work in these areas regardless.
About unbroken. Isn't it broken already by...
Well, this is the question. That's why there's a question mark on it, because we're playing with that. And I think there are big ruptures and breaks, but in terms of social structure, but I think certain threads came through, which is the argument I'll make. Because Heaney, Joyce, they're part of that reimagining, and maybe it's not completely broken. So it depends what you constitute as broken. And that's exactly the point we're making, because I think you can have different arguments about it. But for me, I don't really, maybe you're right and maybe I'm wrong or whatever, who cares? But I'm more interested in how do we actually do that as part of the diaspora and where we're going, rather than being absolutely right on every topic. I don't care less. Okay, so I'm going to start at the sort of beginning of the end of the Ice Age around 10,000 BC. So this is really when that world, what we call now Ireland and Britain, became more habitable, because it was literally under a kilometre of ice. So, there wasn't much life happening, and it was like, this is just way too full on. So in other parts of the world there was lots of life going on, but in that part, the way the sort of Ice Age worked, little dip, and that was just like a K of ice. When that melted, then humans and all these other critters, bears and other critters, sort of rocked up. So, but what we largely talk about are the Celts or the Gaels, and they came from this place, which is basically southern Russia or Ukraine. And that's what we call Proto-Indo-European culture. So when you have a look at, say, for example, the relations between the Gaelic world and language and mythology and the Indian world, you go, are they the same thing? And you go, probably, because they actually got the same root. And that's the root. So some people went down towards the Indus Valley and created what we call Hinduism, and then others went across Western Europe. So the Gaels didn't actually turn up to Ireland, Scotland, England until 500 BC. So when we talk about Gaelic and Celtic culture, strictly speaking, we're wrong. We don't have the right words for it. Because when you look at the great pagan animist sites in Ireland and Scotland and the Orkney, all across that, in England as well, they actually predate Celts by thousands of years. So there's a people there who we don't often talk about, who are, many of us are part of that world, that don't really they didn't have a Celtic language, because that's one of the ways why we talk about Gaelic and Celtic, because it was actually the language group moved across, and then of course the Romans killing off the Celts in 50 BC or so, and then wiping out the British Celts in 50 AD or so, and then that's part of the story. That language survival that survived in certain parts on the edges of Europe where it's very cold and the Atlantic sort of bashes you constantly and the wind goes. So Wurrung and the Boyne Valley happened or was built 3,500 BC. So this is not by Celts. This is by another people, which we don't know much about, except the structures they created. Yes. Yes. And that's a mythic story as well. And that's very much a Celtic thing coming across. The ones predating probably are more goddess-based, and they're moved between settler and hunter-gatherer. And that's something that I'm really interested in, is those people. So when we say Gaelic, we're not talking about them at all. But they're, I think, the most interesting crew, and they're pretty much they're invisible to most of language and culture. But they did the most interesting stuff. So when you go on the land, that's who you're engaging with. That crew, and it's like, oh, you don't even have words the language doesn't work, so they're included. But that's who you're really engaging with. When you go into Wurrung or you go to these sacred sites, they're the ones that set them up. And you're like, aha. So we have these gaps in knowledge. And then 500 BC, the Celts arrive in that whole part of the world. So it's relatively recently.
Where did they come
From the steppes of Russia, and they moved across.
They all came from.
Well, they did.
In different ways.
Yeah, it's sort of waves and that sort of Gaelic language. So part of that, of course, was we don't know this, or we have another gap, because in about 390 BC, the Celts raided Rome. And the Romans waited 300 years and they said, you little beauty. And Julius Caesar rocked up and he wiped out 2 million Celts and wiped out the Gaelic, basically Celtic languages from Europe. And that was the revenge. And then he came back and said, I will now be emperor because I wiped out the Celts. Because they hated the Celts with a passion. So when you look at the history and you see the Celtic stuff all in Germany and Switzerland, it doesn't exist. That language, those people are gone. They've been obliterated. The Romans did that. So when you want to understand intergenerational trauma, this is there's been these waves of sort of genocides going on, and it's not just the ones of the 16th or 19th centuries. There's these ones even predate that. So that's where the English come from, is because then a century later the Romans turned up, Caesar went and looked and couldn't do it, and then they went and did the job 100 years later and wiped out the Celts, the Druids, all the social structure, and made them into Romans. And this is part of the history of why you get these antagonisms in that area, because they got pulverised. And because that part of northern Scotland where the Picts were and Ireland were too cold, they didn't have cities, and the Romans went, there's not enough loot, what for? So it was sort of historical reason they just were able to avoid all this.
Colin, when you say white now, are you talking about the culture? Are you talking about the literal like?
Oh no, the culture. So whoever they were in terms of their relations to place and stories, that got just obliterated. And for 450 years they made them into Romans. And if you didn't do that, then you were going to be.
And what about the massacre of Boudica and all the...
Yeah, well that was the resistance, but she was taken out. And so was Anglesey, which is a Druidic centre. And that's part of the history of all this. But I'm not going into all. I'm just mentioning that quickly as we go to just go, oh yeah, there's been a lot of craziness going on for a long time.
Almost the same amount of time as like 500 years that the Celts were in that area to then when they were 400 years that they were like living like Romans.
Yes. And then the Angles and Jutes turned up, if you know your history, and then various forms of Vikings rocked up, and then the Normans, who were French-speaking Vikings. And then you get the emergence of the British Empire. England and Britain comes out of that. And you're like, aha. So you've got this layering of various 4 or 5 invasions, and then you get the rise of what we call now England and the British Empire and the State of the Union.
Do you know the symbol of the British spiral?
Yes.
It actually comes out of the U-range in the Grand Valley.
Funny you say it, because we're about to talk about it.
Yeah, and U-range is about 5,000 to 7,000 years.
Yeah, 3,000. That's Wurrung. That's what it's called.
And if you go to Bavaria, like southern Germany,
Yep.
that's
Yeah.
equally as old. It was the largest settlement outside of Ireland.
And that's part of my argument. So what I'm doing here is I'm talking about part of the reason why we have this Europeans, because when the Romans came through, they brought what's called Greek logos with them. And they savaged, literally savaged, any form of mythos. And so part of the Roman invasion of Western Europe, so when you meet Germans, you think, mythos is not necessarily going on strong here, but they're super logos. Those guys, they're like, tick, 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 and we do things on time, and we're really rational, we make great cars. And this is part of it, is that Roman coming through, and they brought Greek logos, and they said, no longer are you going to relate to place, you're going to do our stuff, you're going to build our civilization. This is how we're creating the world in our image. And so a lot of Western Europe had that experience of being obliterated, and then you're allowed to exist in one way, and we'll tell you what it is. And obviously the Indigenous people here had a version of that with the British Empire, but it goes on. It's been going on for quite a long time, this carry on. So for 500 years, the Romans conquered and controlled most of modern-day Western Europe, North Africa, and parts of the Middle East. And the Romans didn't only bring with them advanced military engineering and organisational technologies, but also logos. And this is central part of this question. So the Roman Empire conquered, settled, same discussion there as it is here, what we know as Scotland and Ireland. So mythos survived or continued to thrive in these places. And this is part of it. Because they were the edges of empire and they were not seen as valuable, and I'll explain why in a second, the Romans went, it's too much work, we can't get the loot. It's a lot better down there with all the olives and olive oil, and why go to that freezing joint and it's just freezing and horrible and we can't be bothered. So if you look, if you had a choice, you'd be hanging out here somewhere, because it's pretty sexy, I must admit, 25 degrees nearly all the whole year, maybe 40 later. Up here, with that wind coming from the Atlantic, a bit more brutal. And the Romans got there, and I'm being facetious, but there's some truth to it. They were like, they don't have roads, they don't have cities, it's agrarian. Where do we get the loot from? We can't get much loot out of these people. Yeah, savage. Yeah, we were the savages at the time. So exactly. But this was the Roman world, and this is where logos really controlled and dominated. So you're getting bits of mythos that survived in these parts that weren't. Now, of course, there's a whole history of Germany that we won't go into now, but it's got a whole other sort of experience going on. And this is we were bypassed by empire. And this is why we can engage with the Indigenous, because empire sort of went, it's too hard, we can't be bothered. Because if they did the same things that they did to what we now call the English, then we wouldn't be having this discussion. I'd be making my, Germanic cars, and away we go. Okay, now the coming of Christianity. So there's no exact date when Christianity turned up. I know St. Patrick's Day tomorrow. I don't know. It sort of pains me, because it's sort of violent alcoholism is not the only expression of being Irish, but it is part of it, yes, and fighting. I know I got it, but it's just there is more than just that, and wearing silly green hats and being an idiot. I don't doubt we could be idiots. But so now, of course, there's this discussion of St. Patrick, but he wasn't the one that brought it. That's the sort of mythos, and that's fine. It's not in itself wrong or bad. But the source, of course, was Rome and Britain. That's where the actual Christianity came from. So what's interesting about the conversion of so-called Ireland is it was the first place outside of where Catholicism or Christianity set up that actually converted, and it was really easy. They didn't have to do anything. There was no killing. There was no... Now, I think there's reasons as to why, and we'll go into why in a little bit. But I just wanted to explore this coming of Christianity, because this is one of the layers that you need to read through. And why I read the poem about St. Kevin at the start is because a lot of people have this either-or Christian pagan view, and it's very limited. It's a both and. Because animism was kept alive within Christianity, arguably, and you can see in people like Heaney and Joyce and all this crew, it's been kept alive, full stop. But it's syncretism. You've got to be able to read the layers and read what's really happening. It's not just overt, it's not obvious. But we'll look at that in a sec. St. Patrick, maybe a bit less carry on. Okay, so there was in the setting up of the church in Ireland, it wasn't I don't know how many people have come from the church, but I was brought up a Catholic and altar boy in 2 countries and et cetera, so I'm quite well versed. So But in the Gaelic church, when it's set up, what they really got inspired by was the monastic orders. It wasn't, as we now see it, as a diocese with big churches and all the people come to the church. It was a monastic order, and because Ireland was actually pre-urban settlement, they didn't have urban settlements. So they had agrarian settlements, and the monasteries were part of that, and they kept their Gaelic social structures. And so this is central because they were able to engage how they did what they were doing as pre-Christian. They kept a lot of that alive, if you will. Their indigenous society was kept well alive because the monasticism was a very different way of doing Christianity. And if you know anything about monasticism, lots of silence, lots of eating very little food, lots of engagement with... It's very different than the sort of coming down in terms of papal bulls and this is the ideology, etc. Because you'd spend a lot of time in, like St. Kevin, in nature. A lot of time in solitude, a lot of time quiet. So you had a very different sensibility. And again, there's allusions there to the Druidic and the Fili as well. You were keeping these traditions alive, even if you were called father or brother or sister, but you were keeping these other traditions that were sort of implied, that had been going on for millennia in oak groves and in other parts of the place, hanging out with various totems or whatever, and you were keeping them alive. When you look at their book of Kells, you'll see all these animals, and you go, how much of that is totemic? And how much of that is actually keeping alive certain ways of seeing and being in the world that other parts of Christianity were getting rid of? Okay, so the big difference is, and now if you know any of your theology, the big revolution was, of course, Constantine and the church lining up with empire. Now, part of that was this guy called Augustine. You may have heard of him, of Hippo, North African guy. And he's the one that actually created, if you will, helped create the ideology to become a sort of global church. Now, in Ireland, because they became Christians so early, they actually more looked to this guy called Pelagius. And he was in constant battle with Augustine. He had a totally different view. And remember what Augustine was doing, and essentially that argument is essentially those who are like Christ, Pelagius, and those who are followers of Christ. Now, that's a huge difference. One, you've got to do it. The other one, you just got to do what you're told and do what they tell you to do. And there's a very big difference. So if you're actually being like Christ and sort of moving towards Christ consciousness, that's a very different way. And that's why the monasticism was so popular in the Irish context, and it still was until the 16th century, sort of the Reformation, etc. And that's part of the reason why, because this thing of being like Christ is a very different way of being in the world. And you can talk about the St. Francis and the Franciscans and the sort of elements within the church that did that. We've got to be like Christ, not just do what the Pope tells us. So this internal battle. And he denied, that is Pelagius, he denied original sin, he celebrated free will, and he was very into nature. So you're seeing the grounds of what's called Celtic Christianity. And so, some people, and that really survived from, say, the 4th century to the 12th century. It's strong, and then it sort of had to go underground after that and sort of be a bit more syncretic, which we'll talk about.
Was there any Gaelic resistance to the first Christian invasions?
Yes. So it's sort of weird. If you read the stories of St. Bridget, St. Patrick, St. Columba, the three sort of main saints, Columba's different, and I'll explain why in a sec, but all of them were about the battles with the Druids. So when you first read the early hagiography of the stories of the saints, it's all Druidic, and they battle at the same level, and they become the top Druid, if you will. So the way they actually become and write the story to actually take over is they become better than the Druids. And so that's part of the layering. Because even inside the Gaelic church, there was battles as well, which is what I'll explore in a sec, about internally. Because even so, the hierarchy might think this, but then the people on the ground do that, and then other levels do this. And there's all these internal battles. But they were able to keep a whole lot of stuff alive for well until the 17th century, which is what I'm going to argue. So the Gaelic church is a complex and rich form of syncretism. It's basically a form of indigenous culture. And this is why when people go, oh, when I read Celtic Christianity or John O'Donoghue or whatever, I sort of feel that, yeah, this is speaking to me. He talks about the rocks of Connemara, or he talks about beauty, and you're like, yeah, exactly. Because they've been doing that since 400 AD, and obvious pagan influences, and they kept certain things alive.
Can you explain the term syncretism?
Syncretism, is basically you while you take on the structure of the Catholic Church and you might say, gee, let's take it well, and you'll talk about, oh, St. Bridget. But who you really mean when you go there is actually Bridget the Druidess, and you do what they say, and you go around the well 3 times, like the sun does, and you're keeping alive pagan traditions, and you're saying, calling her St. Bridget, but really it's Bridget the goddess or Bridget the Druid you're actually engaging with. So it's sneaky, ha ha ha. And it's like, you think we're doing this, but we're really doing this. And you can see it. I went to Guatemala, Mexico, and it's totally everywhere in Guatemala, Mexico, where you just like, the Mayans and the Aztecs have done that big time. The Virgin de Guadalupe is sneaky, scratchy, Coatlicue. She's the one who demands sacrifice. So she's the Aztec goddess, but they call her the Virgin, and you're like, okay, there's a whole lot going on here that...
Jesus is the mushrooms, the psychedelic.
Well, can be in certain parts, because that's the psychedelia centre of the world, but I think 90% of psychedelics are in some parts of Mexico, and you're like, oh my God. But yeah, so that's syncretism. So, and that's partly what I'm unpicking when I sort of am telling this story, because it's this syncretism.
That's absorption of the old culture by the new culture.
Yes, and that's why I bring up this thing of don't be so caught on either or thinking. Think about both and, because it's sort of... These are very smart people. Now, the main thing I want to do is I want to actually now make this... There's a beehive hut, which is, you know, if you go... Well, there's many of them across, but they're obviously... And this is a place where they'll go. This is part of the monastic orders, where you go inside these huts, back into the womb. These tombs, these wombs, this constant... And then fasting and praying and, you know, keeping alive certain traditions. I think Skellig Michael in the south, in Cork, just south of Cork. So there's a whole, I mean, you might have seen him in Star Wars, I think they were in some, I didn't watch it, but someone's telling me they were in Star Wars. I'm like, I missed that one. I couldn't care less. But so as an example, this is part of the fusions. And this is not just structures that, you know, is Christian.
They're also in Mycenae in Greece.
Ah, well, there you go. So like I was saying, the culture got around. Now there's a guy, and I look to this guy, I really like him now, even though, you know, I'll call myself a pagan at various stages, but I really love a saint. This is what he did. So he was born into a well-connected... He's from Donegal. He became an abbot and set up a number of monastic communities in the north of Ireland and western Scotland, and most famously Iona. So he's one of the main syncretisers. And what he did... So there was a kingdom at the time called Dalriada. So we have to explore... Because we have these notions of Scotland and Ireland, but it's not more complicated than that. Because Dalriada included Western Scotland and a big chunk of Northern Ireland, and that was a kingdom, and that's who he actually aristocratically was related to, and that's why he set up in Iona, because his actual relos owned, you know, because he was a king. He was basically going to be king, but he didn't. He became a monk instead, but he still played the politics. And he was able to get Iona, which was part of Dalriada. So a kingdom of Western Scotland and Northern Ireland, which went from around the 6th to the 10th centuries, and this was part of when St. Columba was going around. Now what he did, and he's central to this whole process, well, there's Dalriada there, as an example. So in 575, at a meeting at Drumket, with a whole lot of different kings and high chiefs of all the different areas, they were going to get rid of the poetic structure, because when the Christians came, they got rid of the Druids. And so some of the Druids actually sneaked into what's called the Feely tradition, which is the poetic tradition, and they hid there, if you will, because the knowledge was being smashed. So what he did was, now Colm McNaughton was also trained as a poet as well as he became a Christian monk. And so what he did was, instead of saying, oh no, we're just going to have this constant, you know, low intensity conflict with the Catholic Church, he brought that whole tradition, the Feely, the poets, into the Christian order. And he hid them in there, and it was able to survive for another 1,000 years. So this is part of the syncretism. And that's why I looked at this guy, because he kept a whole lot of the pagan traditions alive by, instead of sort of fighting against them, he brought them in and was like, aha, gotchas. So when you look at what he did and his influence on Columbanus and his influence through into Germany, setting up monasteries in Germany, etc., and all those Reinhardt mystics that came up in the 13th century, trained by Irish monks, Meister Eckhart, Hildegard of Bingen, etc., this is the lineage you're looking at, and where they kept these things alive and what they're able to do. And so he's central. So basically paganism,
Kind of like a erosion of the, you know, once it merges with Christianity, because that's what I've...
Well, the thing is, and this is the next discussion, is about at a level of ideas maybe, but in the level of place, no. And people are much more place-based. And this is what these very smart guy. So then you didn't have, and you'll see why, because the church really came down hard. And of course the church, you know, the Holy Roman Empire church was very powerful, and they didn't want to set themselves up as a target, you could argue, but they did become one in the 12th century, and they just went, we're enough of this sneaky, hidey, we're just coming in and going to smash you. And that's what they did, which I'll explain in a minute. So he was able to, he really is the sort of political manoeuvrer that was able to actually keep the Gaelic order alive by syncretism. Now you go to his place in Garton in Donegal, and it's stunning. He's one of the main three saints. It's a pagan site, and the whole tradition is around him is pagan. And you just stand there going, what the hell? And there's a big rock, and there's a stone circle for him, and someone's chucked this huge Celtic cross. But this guy is he just bridges those two worlds. And he's like, it's not, because he was part of that hierarchy and that social structure, and he wanted to keep it alive. He wanted those kings to be passed on. And kings, it's not like we understand the English and Scottish kings. This is a very different way of because they were elected, and they had this relationship with the goddess and the land, and these rituals that had to be had. So it's a very different sort of understanding. But he kept, and the lineage he gave birth to is profound. So when you look at the Christian traditions, let's say the mystic traditions, you'll find the Irish monks were teaching those people, and they were the ones training, and they come out of this as well. So their influence is very subtle and very complex. And that's what I'm trying to sort of unpick. Okay, so the Christianisation. There was a big hammering going on. Of course, I talk about how it survived, but of course there was people who were really into that Christian tradition and, internal battles, etc. But on the land, because people were related to the land and place, that's what kept it alive, because they still had to get milk from the cow, and the cow was sacred. And it's not surprising that people had the goddess was a cow, because what was the basis of their diet? And I grew up on a dairy farm, and and you go, of course, because if we don't have this, guess what? We don't exist. Yeah, that's a good point. So let's keep that going. Now, the Vikings transformed Ireland utterly, economically, politically, because there were no big settlements. Basically, the Vikings brought cities. So the Vikings first appear around 800 AD, and they created the first port cities in Dublin, especially Wexford, Waterford, Limerick. Now, they were to sell slaves. We won't mince words. They sold slaves, and they needed a big-ass place to sell them, so that'll do. But that's why there was no diocese, as we understand it, in terms of the Catholic Church, because it was all rural settlements. And it only came around 800 AD where you started to get the development of cities. And for 400 years or so, the Vikings had a big influence, and they actually, because of the trading routes they were creating to Greenland, but also into the Mediterranean, etc., they actually exposed, if you will, the Gaels, the Celts, to a whole lot of different worlds that they had never experienced before. They never got around like that. It was like, what? It was the Vikings did that. Now, yep.
I'm just really interested, obviously as the Vikings do have a lot of impact on that whole area that so much of us hail from ancestrally.
Yep.
How did they, and we've also got all those wonderful Norse kind of myths and everything, but how did they get to be in the kind of, slavery, rapey business? Because surely that was because what we learned about
Slavery, rapey business. No, it's great. No, I agree.
created, that wasn't
No, it's just an excellent way of putting it.
violence in humanity.
Yeah.
I call it the murder rapey business that we're all now stuck in.
Yeah, well, that sounds like the world.
Thank you. So what happened to the Vikings that got them into that kind of...
Well, it largely was problems of lacking of farmland. And they actually started off, that was one of the main reasons. And because of their own kingdoms and how their own internal civil wars, lots of people just went, let's go and do something else. With Norse, what we now call Norse and Danish, they went off, but there's a whole section I'm going to talk about that right now. And this is central because the Vikings are a huge part of what's going on. And we often sort of don't acknowledge that Viking influence at a whole lot of different levels in terms of becoming part of the sort of bigger world, but also in terms of the rise of cities and then the interaction and that whole economic and other developments that happened because of the Vikings, as well as rapey. That's a big part of it too.
Slave economy.
Yeah.
Their main income was from slaves.
Yeah, so we'll get to that in a sec. So
these slaves were Gaelic people?
some of them were.
Kidnapping and exporting,
Yes.
and they were also kidnapping from other places and importing? Or
Yes, all of that. So I'm actually going to argue that Iceland is part of the Gaelic world and the Faroe Islands, etc. That Irish Sea, so we often talk about the Celtic world, and the reason is because the way Iceland was settled, we're going to talk about this now, is they grabbed a whole lot of Scottish or Gaelic women, and that's how they created Iceland. They stole them and raped them and whatever, rapey, or whatever. Whether they were forced or not, I don't know exactly, but that's central. And so, and I'll talk about this in a minute, when you look at the Icelandic sagas, people are like, oh, that's an amazing creation of the Norse culture, and it's not. And this is, Iceland is now saying this, this is actually the influence of Gaelic world, because that actual culture around the poetry, etc., is central to that culture, and it was the women that had the big influence. And they're now only starting to realise and go, oh, that's how we got there. Because there isn't that cultural tradition within Scandinavia, but there is in Scotland and Ireland, etc., or where that storytelling, that poetic tradition is big, high status, and also important in the culture, but the Norse never had that. So here's just some of the impact of the Vikings in terms of especially around the seaports, etc. And we can come back to that. So what I want to do, whoops, I went backwards, went the wrong way. Now what I want to do now is just quickly, I'm going to play a piece from a guy called Yusel Sturrenson, and just let me have a look here. Now what he's doing here is, this is an Icelandic scholar, and he's actually going into the history, he's looking at the history, and he's explaining, actually we have major Gaelic roots. So when you talk about the Gaelic world, you can't really talk about what we'd now, Wales or parts of Wales and Britain, and you've got to include Iceland. And he'll explain why. I'll just give you a little.
Professor at the Árni Magnússon Institute for Icelandic Studies, which is attached to the University of Iceland in Reykjavik. And I began my university studies here in the same building, in Icelandic Studies as it was called, and was soon drawn to the old and medieval literature of Iceland, and in particular the question of origins and how it came about that Iceland was the only country within the Scandinavian family of nations to produce this wealth of literary material, prose, narratives and poetry, and monopolizing the professional court market in Scandinavia as well, all through the late Viking Age and early Middle Ages, and down to the time of writing of these texts in the 13th century. And one of the ideas that had come up in the scholarship already in the 19th century was that this was because of the Gaelic contribution to the culture of Iceland, and we know that the professional status of poetry and storytelling was much higher in the Irish culture than we know of in the Germanic speaking countries. But the current thinking in the 1970s and the early 80s, when I was doing my studies, was that this had really not caught on, this had not been proven, and there was very little evidence to substantiate this idea, and this should rather be explained with notions about Iceland being far away and isolated and having developed some peculiar culture because of the shock effect of the settlement uprooting phenomenon from an old country, settling in a new area, making memories of both that new beginning and the past in the other world. I found rather unsatisfactory, and so I went and did my master's after the BA in Icelandic and comparative literature in Dublin, doing Old Irish and some medieval studies. I postulated that there was a pattern developing, that there were individual motifs from the Irish context to be detected in the oldest story material that we had in the Icelandic sagas, or the stories about the Viking Age. And then in individual family sagas, that is sagas that are set within Iceland, beginning with the settlement, the first people who come and give names to the land, and events and stories start to develop in a previously unsettled territory. The stories that were set in the landscape where there was also memory of settlers coming from the Gaelic world, so either in Scotland or in Ireland. These sagas had more of these Gaelic-like or Old Irish-like motifs than texts from other areas where there was no memory of people from that part of the world being among the first settlers, rather where people were coming directly from Norway. And one of the most fascinating ideas that had come up already in the 19th century was that this was due to the Gaelic cultural contact with the Norse world during the Viking Age in the 9th and 10th centuries, and that this had in particular been important for the development of what happened in Iceland.
Okay, just wanted to plant that seed, just so it's partly what we're doing is, what we're trying to do is, whoops, not used to this computer. Okay, so partly what I'm trying to do is explain some of the layers on the ways that indigeneity was transformed in the Gaelic context. So part of it is there's people who were pre-Celtic. There's the whole history of the emergence of the Celts from coming across Russia, and then there's what the Romans did in terms of what we now call England and Wales, and then there's the Christianisation, and then there's Vikings coming, and how all these things transformed and gave layers to this indigeneity, which again, like I say, many people in this room, if they're not aware of it, this is part of what's going on. So let's have a look. So yeah. So Vikings are another huge part. So the Gaelic world is not just, whoops, I don't know how to make this. What did I do? I changed something and start slideshow. From current slide. Okay, so I'm sure, where is? Anyway, doesn't really matter, I suppose. So the Gaelic world is now understood as being framed by the geographical triangle, Celtic, of that Wales, Scotland, Ireland, Isle of Man, and Iceland, including that in. So it's sort of what it does in terms of your imaginary. So you can draw. That's part of what's happening, and this is very much part of because the role women played, because there was a lot of slave women in the 9th, 10th century, stolen from the Western Hebrides, from Scotland, what we now call Scotland and Ireland, and dragged over by the various, I think it was Norse, Vikings, and then that's how they created Iceland. So now I want to get to what's called the papal, the Anglo-Norman invasion. Excuse me, can I ask you to just help for 1 second in terms of making that so it's actually slideshow again? I don't know what I've done. I undid it and then it's... How do I make it so it up there relates to there? I've done something and I don't know what it was I pressed.
Oh, can I just ask, like...
Yeah, that's the one. That whatever. Yeah, that's the one. PowerPoint slideshow. So how do we get that so I can...
We're going to just take that right away. You don't need it anymore?
Oh, well, just so I can change the slides, because it's I've got stuck. I don't know what it is I did or didn't do. Because that's not... Oh, there, it is good. That's great. All right. That's what it was. I had too many going on. Great. Thank you. Thank you for your technical assistance. Yes, history's good. Technology shit.
I'm getting stuck on this idea of how they're all living like, as Romans. Like,
Who were?
The Celts.
Well, that's in mainly Britain and Wales.
Okay, but then in Ireland and... Okay,
Yes.
So then there's still Celts in Ireland and...
Western Scotland, especially.
There's two old.
Yes.
And the Vikings are going there.
Correct.
They're taking it.
Yes, exactly. So another part I just need to explain is, anyone heard the word gallo glass? Okay, these are really important, and we'll talk about it. Actually, if I think it's actually coming up. No, I'll talk about it in a sec. So in 1169, there was a papal bull, 1155, there was a papal bull. So the church was very concerned this syncretism was happening in this place, Ireland. The Gaelic church was happening, and they were like furious. So they gave the Anglo-Normans the right, you can invade this joint. So when you want to look at the legacy and the foundation of the British Empire, this is it here. This was the training ground where they did their work, and then they went off to India and everywhere in Australia and whatever and did the stuff. But this is where they trained it. And the Pope gave what we call Anglo-Normans the right, you can invade this place because we want to bring him back to line in terms of the church hierarchy and what they should be doing. Because they're just doing too much syncretism, basically. They're just too pagan and we can't stand it. They're just going outside the realms of what we dictate is right. In other words, Augustine's line, not Pelagius. And they're doing their own thing. And they were like, nah. So in 1169, the Anglo-Norman mercenaries landed in Ireland, and this is the start of the colonisation of Ireland, and deposed the king of Leinster, Diarmaid MacMurchata, who sought to help gain his kingship. And so this was the start. Now, when you actually look at this 1169, they never really took over Ireland. What they did was largely around the Dublin area. They were actually controlled, and they never really totally controlled. They would make alliances with different Gaelic kings and do all these incursions and try and... So it was an outpost for the Anglo-Normans, but it wasn't fully colonised. That didn't happen until the early 16th century when the Tudors went, right, we've had enough. And the reason for this is a group of people called the Gallo Glass. Now what they were, they're a group of people, they were mercenaries, and they were along especially the Western Hebridean lines, and we know their surnames, McCabe, etc. And they were trained, they were basically Vikings and the Scots Highlanders bred to create a mercenary force. And whoever actually had that mercenary force, whoever hired them, whichever kings hired them, they ran Ireland for 3 centuries. So from the 12th to the 16th century, they ran the joint. Because these guys were like the killing machines. You just let them loose and they just rock up and just slice everyone to bits and then back to where we go. So if you could pay the dough, the Gallo Glass kept the Anglo-Normans at bay, but then there was technological shifts in the 16th century and a whole lot of shifts happened. But that was reason why, because there was these mercenary forces called Gallo Glass that basically ran the joint. What's that?
Nothing.
Yeah, private armies basically. And the surnames, and depending on your surname, if you have Scottish heritage, you may be part of the Gallo Glass. I was wondering why I sort of liked, the claymore and slashing people.
Would you say that the reason that became so, like, you're saying that Gaelic Ireland and Scotland wasn't colonised until this started to happen, there was already some influence from the Vikings.
Oh, definitely.
That was changing the culture
Yep.
and the right relationship, and for even this business with the Gallo Glass to
Yep.
come up.
Well, I'm 6'4", and a lot of my relos are pretty big, and I trained in martial arts for 25 years, and it's like, let me guess. And I'm at McNaughton, and we go back to Argyle, so it's like, we weren't one of the families, but obviously the other crew had to do it just to stop being bashed by those guys. So I don't know exactly, but it's not unusual. So from the 12th to the 17th centuries, there was plenty of massacres, famines, and dispossessions, but Ireland was never fully conquered. The Anglo-Normans were in their own process in England. They were sort of still doing their own thing and civil warring on each other, and all that history was going on. And then they went, with the Tudors, they went, right, we've had a gutful now. Let's take this joint over. Let's really just... And so the interesting thing is the start of the colonisation of what we call Ireland was actually also part of the war against the indigenous pagan traditions. They're actually the same thing. It's actually the same thing. They're not separate. So you're like, okay, this is part of your history, my history. Many people in this room's history is like, so that indigenous question was central to the war. That was their version of terra nullius. These guys aren't allowed to do this. You can wipe them out whenever you like. Yeah. And if you're doing the church's work, good. Just send us the money. And if there's lots of dead people and, wise women and all that, we don't care. No, just don't show us and we won't make any arguments. I know we're doing the business of Christ. So this is the other scene of Christ, the so-called Christians.
That was the kind of the terra nullius point. You're allowed to do this from like 1170, but then there was like 500 years of just kind of chaos.
Yeah, and what's called the Pale, where they controlled Dublin, the big seaports. They had this economic control, and they did all this interacting, but they weren't able to actually take over. And that happens, as we'll see in a minute, with the Tudors. When the Tudors came in, King Henry VIII and etc., then they went, right, this is time. And this is the foundations of not only what we call the United Kingdom, but the foundations of the British Empire. And this is a whole other gig. And this is the training ground. They needed a training ground to practice all their gear so they could go and do it globally, which is what they did in the 19th century. So, but this is the precursor. So,
Same thing happening in the Highlands in Scotland.
yes, well, like I said before, you can't really separate them because where my folks come from is a place called Cushendore, which is the north of Ireland. You can see Scotland, and you're back and forwards. It's Scottish, and the sort of local dialects are Ulster Scots in that area. And so they've always been back and forwards, and it's not these, we have this idea of nation state now, but back then it was the Irish Sea, and they were back and forwards, and you know, oh, I like this woman, oh no, you can't have her, okay, let's all kill you, and then we'll run over here and steal her, and then they massacre them, and you know, that sort of carry on. It's tribal sort of warfare, which happens in lots of places. So that's sort of the basis of it. So 1593, 1603, these are crucial years. This is where really the big shift. This is when the Indigenous world was really hammered. So a Gaelic alliance rose to defend itself against the English crown, by now they're English, the Tudors' attempts to conquer Ireland. The alliance was led by Hugh O'Neill of Tyrone. So the Gaels were ultimately defeated at the Battle of Kinsale, 1601. So at a military level, the Gaelic world was destroyed then. That was the end of the Gaelic order in terms of chieftains, and the local Indigenous way of doing things was now obliterated. Now the English were coming in going, you know what, we're going to do it our way. We're going to create plantations. We're going to get you off the land. We're going to bring all these dudes from Scotland and England. You're going to take over the land, and then we're going to recolonise it with new people. I'm sure you can see that happening today in Gaza. Happened here. It's like it's a continual sort of thing. It's like, oh, that's 16. No, okay, that's when it happened. It's like that's when it happened there. So at the same time, James VI of Scotland was waging his own war on the Gaels in Scotland. In 1603, he inherits the English throne, which creates Great Britain, a cornerstone of the emergent British Empire. There's your answer to your question. So at the very same time as the Gaelic order is destroyed and that pagan tradition is wiped out, basically at a military sort of structural level, the British Empire emerges. Bang. We got them. We can now do what we need to do. And now we can sort of play with these guys, like sort of an experiment, and see what happens when you starve them and you poke them and see what they do. And oh, look, they fight back and get all angry and haha, gotcha. So that's what happens now. So Gaelic culture is often seen as a threat to the British Empire, and they do everything they can to divide the Gaels in Scotland and Ireland. So what they do is, and I was part of this too, because I got Catholic background, Republican history, and I've got a friend who's Scottish and he's Protestant, but he helped me understand how this has been a divider, and they're always trying to divide the Gaels so they don't unite, and this is a divide and rule strategy. So they'll send Scottish guys back in the day into West Belfast or into South Armagh or into Tyrone as soldiers, even this is in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, 90s, as part of their sort of keeping the Gaels apart and just playing them off against each other so they can take over. The old divide and rule. So in 1607 was the flight of the Earls, and this is the historical symbolic defeat of the Gaelic order. So they lost the battle in Kinsale, and then 6 years later, basically the Gaelic order left to mainland, go and live in mainland Europe, and that was the end. And that's what the poets write about when they sort of say, you know, the death of an Indigenous culture. And there's lots of grieving around this because that structure was basically obliterated. So yes, you had the hidey syncretisms going on, but in terms of any other remnant structures, they were actually now wiped out.
Colin, I'm sorry.
That's all right.
Just chime in about the feminine at this point, because you say that it's only this, what's the word,
Syncretism.
with the church, but there are other ways that this business was hidden.
Of course.
I would say if we're talking about healing trauma, and that's a little bit what this talk is based on, there's a huge amount of trauma of the feminine that people like Columbus and stuff went, yeah, we just have to ally with these people who are our enemies are basically killing the wise women and everything to hide the toxin, but the wise women were saying there's other ways. So I just wanted to just do a reflection there
That's a lot more in the next talk.
needs to happen for the feminine.
Yeah.
For this to be recognised, that it wasn't that wasn't the only option to align with the church.
Yeah.
In my view.
And the feminine in the Gaelic context is the land. So in any of these battles, essentially between, let's say, what we'd call the Gaelic world and the British Empire are essentially battles between those that worship a male god and those that worship female land. That's really what the battles are.
The tarot was hidden in
Yeah.
it. It wasn't just the church that they hid it in, they hid it in
Yeah.
the tarot initiative.
And the only way it could be kind of consciously brought forward into culture was through male structures of power like the church, or like the female voice just is absent in the historical context.
Like the nunnery, or I don't know, like what were the nunneries or
Convents.
something? Like convents?
They were, but this we're also in a very, because of the levels of violence, there was no major witch burnings in Ireland. The reason being, because they went hammer and tongs already, and they're already wiping people out left, right, and centre. So there was no need, because the destruction of all those social structures was already well underway and had already happened.